"Back off." Ava didn't. She kept moving toward the bay, IV kit in hand, eyes steady. The man on the gurney, big, bandaged, jaw set like reinforced steel, pushed himself upright despite the wound dressing across his shoulder. "I said back off, bitch!" The trauma bay went completely still. Dr. Caldwell stepped forward. "Nurse, leave the bay. Now." Ava set the IV kit on the tray, snapped on her gloves, and spoke 2 quiet words directly to the SEAL, his call sign, the one buried inside a classified joint operation that officially never happened, the one nobody alive should know. The SEAL's entire body stopped. His face, hard and hostile 2 seconds ago, shifted into something nobody in that room had ever seen on a man like him. Confusion, then recognition, then something close to disbelief. His voice dropped to almost nothing. "Ghost?" Ava held his gaze for exactly 1 second, then turned to Dr. Caldwell. "He'll cooperate now. Before we begin, hit subscribe and drop ghost in the comments. By the end of this story, that word is going to mean something completely different to you." Mercy General Hospital didn't look like the kind of place where secrets came to die. It looked like every other busy ER in San Diego. Fluorescent lights humming above cracked linoleum floors, the smell of antiseptic hanging in the air like a permanent resident, gurneys moving in and out of bays with the rhythmic urgency of a place that never fully stopped. Tuesday afternoons were supposed to be quiet, manageable. The kind of shift where the biggest drama was a disagreement over the supply room schedule or which resident had forgotten to restock Bay 2 again. Ava had learned to appreciate those shifts, not because she was lazy. Anyone who watched her work for 10 minutes would scratch that theory entirely, but because quiet shifts meant nobody was dying. And in Ava's personal history, that was never something she took for granted. She was 6 weeks into the job, the rookie, the one doctor. And Caldwell had already pulled aside twice to remind her that observation was her primary function right now, not independent decision-making. She had nodded both times, said nothing, and gone right back to noticing everything. Nobody at Mercy General knew much about her. That was partly by design and partly just the nature of who she was. She had arrived in San Diego 8 months ago from the UK. No family mentioned, no dramatic backstory offered, no LinkedIn profile to scroll through during a slow night shift. She rented a small apartment near the waterfront, close enough to hear the water, if she left the window open. She had applied for her nursing license through an accelerated qualification program, and her medical knowledge had been so far beyond what they expected that her supervisors quietly assumed she must have been a physician abroad who hadn't yet requalified in the US system. She never confirmed that. She never denied it either. She just worked, showed up early, stayed late when it mattered, spoke when she had something worth saying, which was less often than most people were comfortable with. Her colleagues liked her in the careful, slightly uncertain way people like someone they can't quite read. Dr. Caldwell found her competent and unremarkable. That suited Ava perfectly. She was updating a chart at the nurses' station when the doors opened and the shift changed entirely. 2 men came in first, both in civilian clothes, both moving with the kind of physical economy that had nothing to do with the gym and everything to do with years of training that rewired how a person occupied space. Between them, half supported and half refusing to be supported, was a third man. Big, broad-shouldered. A field dressing wrapped tight around his left shoulder, already showing a dark bloom of dried blood through the gauze. His jaw was set, his eyes were moving. Not the panicked scanning of someone in pain and frightened. The deliberate, cataloging sweep of someone assessing a room for threats before deciding whether to stay in it. Ava recognized that look. She had worn it herself, in rooms a great deal more dangerous than this one. She set her pen down slowly and watched. The triage nurse moved toward them immediately. The man with the shoulder wound, he hadn't given his name yet. It hadn't given anything yet. Stopped walking the moment she approached. Not because of the pain. His 2 companions were calm, professional, already reaching for the intake process with the practiced patience of people who'd done this before. But the man himself fixed the triage nurse with a look that made her slow her steps without fully understanding why. Dr. Caldwell appeared from the corridor, assessed the situation in about 3 seconds, and directed them to Trauma Bay 4. What happened next in that bay over the following 20 minutes was enough to cycle through every available nurse on the floor. He refused vitals, he refused the intake form, he refused to confirm his identity, his unit, or the origin of the wound. When a male nurse attempted to check his blood pressure a second time, he grabbed the man's wrist with his uninjured arm and held it with enough controlled force that the nurse went very still and very quiet. Caldwell tried reasoning. The man stared at him the way you stare at a wall. By the time Caldwell stepped back out of the bay, his expression had moved from clinical authority into something that looked a great deal more like exhaustion. He looked down the hallway. Ava was already standing there, IV kit in hand, watching the bay with calm and steady eyes. Caldwell pointed at her with the particular energy of a man who had run out of better options. She was the rookie. She was the last nurse standing. She was, in his professional estimation, probably about to have a very unpleasant few minutes. She walked toward the bay without hesitating. She pushed the door open. The man on the gurney turned toward her the way a radar dish turns toward a signal. Immediate, locked, assessing. She was blonde, slight, dressed in slightly wrinkled blue scrubs with a hospital ID that read Ava A. E.R. Nurse, clipped to her left pocket. She looked by every visible measure like exactly what her ID said she was. She moved toward the tray to set down her kit, and he came upright off the gurney with a speed that genuinely should not have been possible for someone with a shoulder wound, planting one hand on the rail and fixing her with a look that had probably ended conversations in 4 different countries. His voice was low and direct, and carrying just enough controlled edge to make the 2 nurses visible through the bay window. Take a step back from the glass. Back off, he said. Ava didn't. She kept moving, set the kit down, reached for her gloves, and he said it again, louder this time, uglier, the kind of language that made Dr. Caldwell press 2 fingers to his temple and start moving back toward the bay. Ava snapped the second glove into place. She looked at the man directly for the first time since entering the room. Not with hostility, not with fear. With the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who is measuring the distance between what a situation looks like and what it actually is. And then she said 2 words. Quietly, almost conversationally, not his name, not a rank, something older than either of those things. A word from a world that didn't exist on paper. His call sign, from an operation that had no official record, no surviving documentation, and a casualty list that the British and American governments had jointly agreed to never discuss publicly. The bay went silent in the specific way that silence arrives when something has shifted and nobody in the room yet understands what or why. The man on the gurney had gone completely still. His hand was still on the rail. His eyes were locked on her face with an expression that moved through several distinct stages in the space of about 4 seconds. Suspicion, confusion, a flash of something that looked almost like fear. And then, underneath all of it, the fragile and disoriented look of someone whose understanding of what was possible had just been quietly restructured. His voice, when it came, was barely above a breath. Ghost? And somewhere down the corridor, without either of them noticing, the senior teammate had stopped walking and was watching the bay window with an expression that suggested this was not entirely a surprise, and that whatever happened next was going to be a great deal more complicated than a shoulder wound. The word hung in the air between them like smoke after a gunshot. Ghost. Rains hadn't said that word out loud in 3 years, hadn't allowed himself to think it too loudly either, if he was being honest, which he rarely was, about that particular chapter of his life. The official record said Ghost was killed in action during a classified joint operation in denied territory. No body recovered, no formal service, a name on a list that most people with clearance had been quietly encouraged to stop asking about. And yet here she was, standing in a trauma bay in San Diego in hospital scrubs, holding an IV kit, waiting for him to finish having whatever internal crisis he was currently having so she could treat his shoulder wound. He stared at her for a long moment. She looked back at him with the patience of someone who had waited out far more uncomfortable silences than this one. Then, because Rains was above everything else, a man who had learned to survive by staying functional when his brain wanted to shut down, he did the only logical thing available to him. He sat back down on the gurney and let her work. That didn't mean he trusted her. Trust, for a man like Rains, was not a switch that flipped because of a single correct word. It was a door that opened 1 careful inch at a time, and even then you kept your foot against the frame. The call sign meant she had access to information that almost nobody alive should have. That was significant, but it also meant, and this was the part his training would not let him ignore, that if someone wanted to get close to him in a controlled environment, or feeding that word to the right person would be exactly how they'd do it. So he watched her hands, watched her eyes, watched the way she moved around the bay with a spatial awareness and an economy of motion that belonged to a very specific category of person. She wasn't performing calm, she was calm. There was a difference, and Rains had spent enough years around both types to know it immediately. She cut away the outer layer of the field dressing with practiced confidence, not the careful, slightly hesitant approach of someone trying to do a thing correctly, but the fluid motion of someone for whom this was deeply automatic, like she'd done it in worse light than this, in worse conditions, without a tray of clean instruments within arm's reach. Dr. Caldwell appeared at the bay window for the third time in 10 minutes. He had watched the shift in Rain's behavior with the expression of a man who had correctly identified that something significant had just occurred and incorrectly assumed he had the authority to demand an explanation for it. He pushed open the bay door and looked at Ava with the particular energy of a senior physician who feels the edges of a situation slipping past his control. He needed to know what she had said to him. Ava looked up briefly from the dressing and told him, in a tone that was entirely respectful and entirely immovable, that she had said something the patient needed to hear. Caldwell stared at her for a moment. Then he told her with the clipped precision of someone choosing words carefully, because he was aware there were other people in the corridor, that she was a 6-week nurse and not a negotiator, and that whatever personal approach she was currently employing had better not generate a single piece of documentation that landed on his desk. Nay, he left without waiting for a response. Ava went back to the dressing. Rains watched this exchange with an expression that, for the first time since his arrival, contained something other than hostility. It was brief, but it was there. Then he started testing her. It was subtle at first, the kind of clinical questions that could almost pass as a patient trying to understand his own treatment, wound irrigation timing, pressure management in high-contamination environments, the specific risk profile of field dressings applied under resource scarcity and then left in place during transport. He framed them casually. She answered them without framing them at all, directly, specifically, with the quiet confidence of someone pulling from memory rather than training. He shifted the angle, asked about improvised tourniquet timing and the downstream complications of delayed fasciotomy assessment. She answered that too. He went quiet for a stretch. She continued working. The monitor beside them beeped in its slow, steady rhythm, and the sounds of the ER moved around the bay like weather outside a window. Finally, he said it. "Where did you train?" Not as a question, almost as a formality. Something he was asking because the answer would confirm what he already knew rather than tell him anything new. Ava didn't look up. "Does it matter?" she said. And the way she said it was not evasive. It was simply the response of someone who understood that the answer existed in what she'd already demonstrated and that words on top of that would be redundant. Outside the bay, the dynamic had shifted in a way that nobody had formally acknowledged. The 2 teammates who had brought Rains in were still in the corridor. Protocol kept them out of the treatment area, but nobody had asked them to leave the floor, and neither of them had volunteered to go. The younger one was leaning against the wall, scrolling his phone with the detached patience of someone used to waiting. The older one, senior, late 40s, a face that had the particular weathered quality of someone who had spent serious time in serious places, was not looking at his phone. He was standing still with his arms loosely crossed and his eyes fixed on the bay window. Not on Rains, on Ava. He had been watching her since roughly the moment the shouting stopped. His expression gave nothing away, but his stillness was the focused kind, the kind that meant he was thinking hard and fast about something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out his phone, typed a short message to a contact whose name the audience never sees, put the phone away, and went back to watching. Inside the bay, Rains had stopped testing and started something closer to talking. Not much, not warmly, but the wall had developed cracks, and through those cracks came fragments. The operation, the collapse, the extraction that went wrong in the 3rd hour, the names of people who hadn't made it out. He wasn't telling her things she didn't know. He seemed to understand that. He was more processing, out loud, in the presence of the one other person in the world who had been inside the same darkness and had apparently walked out the other side of it and somehow ended up in San Diego in blue scrubs. At one point, he stopped mid-sentence and looked at her with a directness that had nothing aggressive left in it. Just wait. Well, it's the kind that accumulates over years of carrying something without anywhere to set it down. If you've ever been in a room where someone finally saw you for exactly who you are, comment "seen" below, because that is precisely what is happening in Bay 4 right now. He looked at her for a long moment. Then his voice dropped to something that barely qualified as sound. "You were listed as killed in action," he said, not as an accusation, not even really as a statement. More like a man reading a sentence out loud that he had always suspected was a lie and was only now finding out for certain. Ava smoothed the last piece of tape across his new dressing. Her hands were steady. Her face was still. She didn't answer. She didn't deny it. She capped the saline, set it on the tray, and checked the monitor reading with the focused neutrality of someone whose internal world was running at a frequency the room simply didn't have access to. And across the corridor, and the senior teammate had gone very still in a new way. The way a person goes still when a puzzle piece they've been holding for 3 years finally shows them where it fits. There is a specific kind of memory that doesn't live in the mind. It lives somewhere lower, in the chest, in the hands, in the automatic tightening of muscles that were trained to respond before the brain finished forming the thought. Ava had spent 8 months in San Diego working very hard to keep those memories exactly where she'd put them. Folded, compressed, stored somewhere that didn't interfere with chart updates and IV rotations and the particular rhythm of a civilian hospital that had never once asked anything of her that required her to be anything other than careful and present and unremarkable. She had been good at that. Impressively good, considering. But the moment Rains had said that word, her call sign, in that voice, in that specific register of disbelief, something in the lower part of her chest had shifted, not broken open, just moved. The way a door moves when the pressure on both sides of it finally equalizes. She finished updating his chart at the nurse's station and stood still for exactly 3 seconds. Then she went back into the bay. The senior teammate was already there. He hadn't knocked, hadn't announced himself. He had simply appeared in the doorway of Bay 4 the way people with his background tended to appear in doorways, as if the concept of a room having an entrance was something that applied to other people. His name was Harker, Chief Petty Officer, retired, currently operating in a capacity that didn't have a clean title. He was the older one, the one who had been watching the bay window with that particular quality of stillness that meant he was running calculations behind his eyes. He looked at Ava when she entered, not with surprise, with the measured recognition of a man who had suspected something for the past 40 minutes and was now simply confirming it. Rains looked between the two of them. "Harker," he said, the word carrying both a name and a question. Harker didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Ava and said her name, not ghost, not nurse, not the name on her hospital ID, her actual name. The one that appeared on a classified casualty list dated 3 years ago, beside the word confirmed and the word that every person who had ever served alongside her knew was wrong. The bay went quiet in a new way, because Rains hadn't known her real name either. That was the detail that unlocked everything. In the operation they had shared, Hollow Crown, Joint SAS, and SEAL extraction, denied territory, third-hour collapse, call signs were the only currency. Real names were a liability. A captured operator with a real name was a thread that could be pulled. Ghost had been Ghost from the first briefing to the last transmission, and Rains had never thought to question it because in that world you didn't. But Harker knew it, which meant Harker's involvement in whatever was currently happening went deeper and further back than a routine hospital transport with an injured teammate. Rains looked at Harker with the expression of a man recalibrating several assumptions simultaneously. Harker finally turned to him and said, quietly and without particular drama, that he had suspected since roughly the moment the shouting stopped, that the way she moved, the spatial positioning, the instrument handling, the complete absence of any performative stress response in a high-pressure environment had flagged something he couldn't immediately name. And then she had answered Rains's clinical questions with the specific knowledge base of a Tier 1 combat medical operator, and the flag had become a certainty. He had sent one message to one contact. The contact had confirmed in under 6 minutes. Ava listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she said, "Are we done?" and turned to check Rains's monitor reading. Here's what the official record said about Ghost and Hollow Crown. But a joint SAS and SEAL team had been inserted to extract a high-value asset from a location that 3 separate intelligence sources had confirmed was clear. It was not clear. The intelligence had been compromised before the team hit the ground, fed through a channel that someone, somewhere, had been selling access to for a period that the subsequent internal review described as significant without ever specifying exactly how significant. The team made it to the asset. The extraction collapsed in the 3rd hour. 4 personnel were listed as killed in action. The asset made it out. The inquiry that followed was conducted privately, concluded quietly, and produced a report that was classified at a level that meant the people most directly affected by its findings were among the least likely to ever read it. Ghost, Ava, had been the embedded SAS combat medic. She had kept 2 SEAL operators alive through the collapse using equipment that would have been considered inadequate in a field hospital and was genuinely inadequate in the environment she was working in. She had gotten them to the extraction point. She had not made it onto the aircraft before the window closed. The official record said she died in the field. The official record, as Rains had always privately suspected, and was a document written by people who needed a clean column and weren't particularly invested in its accuracy. She came to San Diego because of Rains, not in a dramatic sense, not to find him, not to confront him, not to hand him a folder of evidence and demand answers about Hollow Crown. She had come because after the exit debrief and the new identity and the accelerated nursing qualification and the 8 months of building a life small enough to be invisible, she had needed one specific piece of confirmation, that someone who had been inside that operation was still alive and functional and out in the world. Rains had been her reference point. The one name she knew had made it out. She had chosen San Diego because he was stationed here, had never expected him to physically appear in her emergency room on a Tuesday afternoon with a shoulder wound and a threat posture, and had absolutely not prepared for the moment his call sign would come out of her mouth like something she had been holding between her teeth for 3 years. That was the part she hadn't planned. Harker looked at her when she finished and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's either the most human thing I've ever heard or the worst operational security I've encountered in 20 years. Ava said, "Probably both." Rains made a sound that in a different context might have been a laugh. Then Ava's eyes moved to the monitor, and something changed in her face, not dramatically, just a subtle sharpening, the specific quality of attention that arrives when a trained eye catches something that shouldn't be there. Rains's blood pressure had shifted, not critically, not yet. But the pattern was one she recognized from a context that had nothing to do with a clean trauma bay, and everything to do with field dressings applied under pressure in poor conditions, and then left in place during transport without reassessment. She looked at his arm, checked the capillary refill, asked him if he had any tingling in his fingers with a casualness that didn't match the speed at which she was now moving. He said, "Some." She was already at the door. Caldwell was in the corridor. She told him directly. Possible early compartment syndrome, right arm. She needed imaging immediately. As Caldwell looked at her with the expression he had been refining across 6 weeks of working alongside her, the one that sat precisely between professional skepticism and the creeping awareness that she had not yet been wrong about anything that mattered. "The imaging doesn't indicate," he started. Ava told him exactly what type of field dressing had been used on Rains before arrival, the specific compression profile it created, the documented risk window for compartment syndrome onset in that exact scenario, and the reason the early imaging wouldn't clearly show what was already beginning to happen in the tissue. She said it the way she said most things, quietly, directly, without performance. Caldwell stood in the corridor for a moment after she finished. A senior nurse passing behind him slowed slightly, caught the tail end of the exchange, and kept walking with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something they intended to think about later. Caldwell ordered the imaging. And when the results came back and he stood in the corridor, holding them with an expression that had moved well past professional skepticism into something that looked considerably more like reckoning, he looked up at Ava, who was already preparing the fasciotomy tray with the calm efficiency of someone who had known what those results would say before the machine printed them. "How did you know that?" he said. "Because I've seen it before," she said. And the question that nobody in that corridor had thought to ask yet, where exactly had a 6-week rookie nurse seen it before, was about to get the only answer that could possibly explain everything. The procedure took 40 minutes. Not long, or in the architecture of surgical time, But the particular quality of those 40 minutes was different from the ordinary rhythm of Mercy General's operating schedule. Caldwell led it. Ava assisted. And what struck the scrub nurse present, a veteran of 11 years in that hospital, who had assisted on hundreds of procedures and had a finely calibrated sense of how rooms felt during them, was not anything dramatic. It was the quiet, not the focused quiet of a routine case running smoothly. Something older than that. The quiet of two people who had independently arrived at the same understanding of what needed to happen and were executing it without the usual friction of hierarchy and explanation and the small territorial negotiations that filled most surgical spaces. Caldwell would reach a decision point, and Ava would already have the relevant instrument ready. He would adjust his angle, and she would shift her position a half second before he needed her to. And at one point he paused, at a brief, almost imperceptible hesitation at a specific juncture in the procedure, and Ava said one quiet word that told him exactly what the next step was. He did it without question. The scrub nurse watched this and said nothing, and filed it somewhere in the back of her mind under a category that didn't have a clean label yet. When it was done, Caldwell stood at the scrub sink for a long time, longer than necessary. The water ran over his hands, and he looked at the middle distance with the expression of a man reorganizing something internal that had previously been arranged with considerable confidence. He had built his understanding of Ava over 6 weeks. Rookie, capable, slightly unusual, probably foreign medical background, good instincts, needed supervision. And that architecture was still standing, but every single load-bearing wall had just been quietly replaced with something different, and he was still working out whether the structure meant the same thing it had meant this morning. He dried his hands, walked into the corridor, and went to find her. She was at the nurse's station, updating the post-procedure notes with the same focused efficiency she brought to every administrative task. Not perfunctory, not hurried, just present. Caldwell stood across the station from her for a moment before he spoke. He told her he had pulled her personnel file that morning, accelerated nursing qualification, no prior medical employment on record anywhere in the system, graduate degree listed as incomplete. She kept writing. He said, "None of that's real, is it?" She looked up then, met his eyes with the steady, undefended directness that was possibly the most consistent thing about her. "The license is real," she said. Caldwell looked at her for another moment. Something moved across his face that wasn't quite a smile but occupied the same general neighborhood. He nodded once, slowly, deliberately, the nod of a man formally updating a file in his head, and walked away without another word. It was, for Caldwell, practically a speech. Harker left the hospital at the end of the afternoon. He stopped at the nurse's station on his way out, not Ava's station, the main one near the entrance, and left a folded piece of paper with the charge nurse, asking her to pass it to the nurse in Bay 4. He didn't wait to see if she got it. He walked out through the sliding doors and into the San Diego afternoon, with the unhurried pace of a man who had done what he came to do and had several other things to do before the day was finished. Ava received the note 20 minutes later. She unfolded it at the nurse's station, read it once, read it again, and then folded it carefully back along its original creases and put it in the left pocket of her scrubs, the same pocket where her hospital ID sat. The charge nurse, who had been watching with the casual attentiveness of someone who had nothing pressing to do in that exact moment, said, "Good news?" Ava considered this for a second. Then she said, "Depends on your definition." She went back to her charts. The last thing she did before the end of her shift was stop by recovery. Rains was awake. The hostility was gone, not replaced by warmth exactly, but by something more honest than warmth, which was the particular quality of ease that exists between people who have seen each other in conditions that removed every available pretense. His arm was properly dressed. His color was better. He looked like a man who had arrived at a hospital expecting a routine inconvenience, and had instead spent an afternoon having several foundational beliefs about the world gently and thoroughly dismantled. Ava stood at the foot of his bed. The recovery ward had its own quiet, softer than the ER, slower, the kind of quiet that had room in it for things that didn't fit in louder spaces. Raines looked at her for a moment. Then he asked, "Why San Diego?" She looked out the window, at the late afternoon light sitting on the buildings across the street. She told him she needed to know he made it out. That was all. Just that. He was quiet for a stretch after that, the kind of quiet that meant he was absorbing something rather than formulating a response to it. Then he said, "You could have just called." And Ava said, "You were listed as dead too." Rains looked at her, and for the first time since his arrival at Mercy General, the expression on his face was something that had nothing complicated in it at all. Just a man briefly and completely, not performing anything for anyone. The ward settled into its evening rhythm around them. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped twice and went quiet. A nurse passed the doorway without looking in. Outside the window, the light was doing what San Diego light does at that hour, going gold and unhurried, and again, the way light behaves in places that don't know they're being looked at. Ava adjusted the blanket at the foot of his bed with the small, automatic gesture of someone for whom care was not a decision but a reflex. Then she straightened up and said, "Get some rest." She walked to the door. Rains watched her go. Just before she reached the corridor, he said her name, her real one, the one Harker had used in the Bay, the one that didn't appear on her hospital ID. She stopped, didn't turn around. "Thank you," he said, "not for the procedure, not for the fasciotomy catch, or the 6 weeks of quietly being the most competent person in the building, without making it anyone else's problem, for the thing underneath all of that, for coming to San Diego, for needing to know." She stood in the doorway for one moment. Then she walked back into the hospital. The ER was moving the way it always moved, busy, loud at the edges, purposeful in its center. Caldwell was at the board, and 2 residents were debating something near Bay 2. The charge nurse was on the phone. Everything was exactly as it had been at the start of the shift, and nothing was exactly as it had been at the start of the shift, and Mercy General didn't know the difference yet. Ava sat down at her station, pulled up her next chart, adjusted her ID badge out of habit, the one that said Ava A, ER nurse in plain, clean letters that told you everything and nothing at all. The hospital had hired a rookie, and what it had gotten was something the official record had once decided no longer existed. And in the left pocket of her scrubs, folded along its original creases, was a piece of paper that suggested, quietly, and with the particular weight of things written by people who choose their words because they mean them, that someone, somewhere, was reconsidering that decision. If this story gave you chills, you already know what to do. Hit subscribe so you never miss the moment a quiet person in the room turns out to be the most important one in it. And if you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were dealing with, this channel was made for you. Welcome.